Vladimir Lenin on the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. The growth of the revolutionary movement of all the proletariat in all countries has called forth convulsive efforts of the bourgeoisie and its agents in workmen's organizations to find ideal political arguments in defense of the rule of the exploiters. Among these arguments stands out particularly condemnation of dictatorship and defense of democracy. The falseness and hypocrisy of such an argument, which has been repeated in thousands of forms in the capitalist press, and at the conference of the Yellow International in February 1919, are evident to all who have not wished to betray the fundamental principle of socialism. First of all, this argument is used with certain interpretations of democracy in general and dictatorship in general, without raising the point as to which class one has in mind. Such a statement of the question, leaving out consideration the question of class as though it were a general national matter, is direct mockery of the fundamental doctrine of socialism, namely, the doctrine of class struggle, which the socialists who have gone over to the side of the bourgeoisie recognize when they talk, but forget when they act. For in no civilized capitalist country does there exist democracy in general, but there exists only bourgeois democracy, and one is speaking not of dictatorship in general, but of dictatorship of oppressed classes, that is, of the proletariat with respect to the oppressors and exploiters, that is, the bourgeoisie, in order to overcome the resistance which the exploiters make in their struggle to preserve their rule. History teaches that no oppressed class has ever come into power, and cannot come into power without passing through a period of dictatorship, that is, the conquest of power, and the forcible suppression of the most desperate and mad resistance, which does not hesitate to resort to any crimes, such has always been shown by the exploiters. The bourgeoisie, whose rule is now defended by the socialists who speak against dictatorship in general, and who espouse the cause of democracy in general, has won power in the progressive countries at the price of a series of uprisings, civil wars, forcible suppression of kings, feudal lords, and slave owners, and of their attempts at restoration. The socialists of all countries, in their books and pamphlets, in the resolutions of their congresses, in their propaganda speeches, have explained to the people thousands and millions of times the class character of these bourgeois revolutions, and of this bourgeois dictatorship. Therefore, the present defense of bourgeois democracy, in the form of speeches about democracy in general, and the present wails and shouts against the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the form of wails about dictatorship in general, are a direct mockery of socialism, and represent in fact going over to the bourgeoisie and denying the right of the proletariat to its own proletariat revolution, and a defense of bourgeois reformism. Precisely at the historic moment when bourgeois reformism is collapsing the world over, and when the war has created a revolutionary situation. All socialists who explain the class of character of bourgeois civilization, or bourgeois democracy, of bourgeois parliamentarism, express the thought which Marx and Engels expressed with the most scientific exactness when they said that the most democratic bourgeois republic is nothing more than a machine for the suppression of the working class by the bourgeoisie, for the suppression of the mass of the toilers by a handful of capitalists. There is not a single revolutionist, not a single Marxist of all those who are now shouting against dictatorship and for democracy, who would not have sworn before the workman that he recognizes this fundamental truth of socialism. And now, when the revolutionary proletariat begins to act and move for the destruction of this machinery of oppression, and to win the proletarian dictatorship, these traitors to socialism report the situation as though the bourgeoisie were given the laborers pure democracy, as though the bourgeoisie were abandoning resistance and were ready to submit to the majority of the toilers, as though there were no state machinery for the suppression of labor by capital in a democratic republic. Workmen know very well that freedom of meetings, even in the most democratic bourgeois republic, is an empty phrase, for the rich have all the best public and private buildings at their disposal, and also sufficient leisure time for meetings, and for protection of these meetings by the bourgeois apparatus of authority. The proletarians of the city and of the village, and the poor peasants, that is, the overwhelming majority of the population, have none of these three things, so long as the situation is such. Equality, that is pure democracy, is sheer fraud. The capitalists have always called freedom the freedom to make money for the rich and the freedom to die of hunger for workmen. The capitalists call freedom the freedom of the rich, freedom to buy up the press, to use wealth, to manufacture and support so-called public opinion. The defenders of pure democracy, again in actual fact, turn out to be the defenders of the most dirty and corrupt system of the rule of the rich over the means of education of the masses. They deceive the people by attractive, fine-sounding, beautiful but absolutely false phrases, trying to persuade the masses from the concrete, historic task of freeing the press by the capitalists who have gotten control of it. Actual freedom and equality will exist only in the order established by the communists, in which it will be impossible to become rich at the expense of another, where it will be impossible either directly or indirectly to subject the press to the powers of money, where there will be no obstacle to prevent any toiler from enjoying and actually realizing that equal right to the use of public printing presses and a public fund of paper. Dictatorship of the proletariat resembles dictatorship of other classes in that it was called forth by the need to suppress and forcible resistance of a class that was losing its political rulership. But that which definitely distinguishes a dictatorship of the proletariat from a dictatorship of other classes, from a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, in all the civilized capitalist countries, is that the dictatorship of the landlords and of the bourgeoisie was the forcible suppression of the resistance of the overwhelming majority of the population, namely, the toilers. On the other hand, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the forcible suppression of the resistance of exploiters, that is, of an insignificant minority of the population, of landlords and capitalists. It therefore follows that a dictatorship of the proletariat must necessarily carry with it not only changes in the form of institutions of democracy, speaking in general terms, but specifically such a change as would secure an extension such as never been seen in the history of the world of actual use of democratism by the toiling classes.